Welcome everyone to the second of our readers this year for the James Agee Online Reading Series. My name is Charles White. I'm with the English Department at Pellissippi State. It's my pleasure to introduce Jane Harrington, who will be discussing her novel, Encircling Flight, and discussing the ways that she makes fiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pellissippi, for inviting me to be part of the Agee reading series. I'm so pleased to be able to share my new book with you. Encircling Flight was published in June by Brighthorse Books. It's a contemporary novel set in the southern Appalachian region, and the story revolves around the lives of two young women who become friends when one is left alone on a farm after the sudden loss of her partner, and the other is displaced by environmental degradation of the hollow where she lives. The latter plot line is buttressed by a backstory that follows the exodus of her ancestors from Ireland during the Great Hunger of the mid-1800s and their settling of the home place in the Appalachians. And it's the technique I used to embed this story that I will be discussing today. First, though, I'll describe the overall structure of the novel, which is divided into two books. A colleague of mine in the English department at Washington and Lee University called these intersecting novellas, which I think is an insightful way to describe the component parts of this novel, and also perhaps a good topic for a craft talk, but on another day. Book one starts with the first main character, Lida, and follows her storyline, the details of which I'm not going to get into today. But in the course of Lida's story, she meets Shannon, the other main character, who's a single mother living in the hollow. Her family has been in the hollow since the mid-1800s, a hollow which is now ravaged by the effects of mountaintop removal, coal mining, toxic water, flooding, etc. Shannon decides she has to leave for the sake of her children's health and safety. So book two follows Shannon's story from there. And that's where we hear the Irish immigration tale, which has been referred to in book one, but not in any detail. I'm going to read an excerpt from the start of book two, which demonstrates how the Irish storyline is woven in, and then I'll comment more specifically on the technique. But for context, at this point in the overall story, Shannon and her two children, Mitch, who's a kindergartner, and Muriel, who's a toddler, have moved in with a woman named Dot, Shannon's new partner, who is an environmental activist. Together, Shannon and Dot have been working to raise awareness about mountaintop removal mining by showing free movies, documentaries, and the like to communities in the region. Something else you need to know is that there will be mention of somebody named Sean, who readers of the novel get to know well in book one. He is Shannon's cousin, who is close with the family and uncle figure to the kids. His name will also pop up in a second excerpt I'm going to read. So, book two, Sullivan's Holler. Imolc. What the fuck is a linnet? Mitch, now where'd you pick that up? Shannon has been making a special point to not use cuss words around him since the new teacher sent the note home about his behavior. And Shannon's pretty sure anyway, that she never used that one within reach of his hearing. Dot, he says, flicking the toes of his sneakers back and forth through the rungs of the metal utility stool where he's perched on a cherry red ruffled cushion. Shannon looks to the window over the sink, to where her partner is gazing out, pupils pinpoints against the whiteout of sun on snow. I thought we were watching our mouths around the kids, Shannon says. Dot doesn't respond at first, then comes out with, oh, I know, West Virginia. You're changing the subject, Shannon says, thrumming fingertips on the enameled tabletop in front of her. Metal, too. Dot likes shiny things, and this is her kitchen. No, I'm not, Dot says, smiling, to which Shannon rolls her eyes, though she admits to herself the truth in this statement. Dot is pretty much a one-subject woman. There's a camp up that way along the Kanawha River. We should go. What are you talking about? Shannon asks. Justice Camp. The people fighting the extraction industries come together up there and help each other think up ways to save the mountains. We could lead a workshop on what we've been doing with the movies and get some new strategies. We're about out of places within reach of here to do showings. Dottie, it's the middle of winter, and Mitch has school. Maybe you go do that by yourself and bring us a report home. I don't mean now, she says. It just came to me is all. I'll get us signed up for a weekend in spring. She shrinks from the window, rubs playful knuckles into the boy's flyaway hair. You want to go to camp, right, Mitch? Do they got snakes there? Shit, yeah, she says. You should see all the brown snakes in the river. And the trails around there get you a workout, make your muscles strong. Want to take the mountain bikes up? Shit, yeah, he says, eyes round and with a spark that isn't often there these days. He's homesick for the hollow. Dot? Shannon signs zip it over her mouth. Sorry, she says to Shannon. Then to Mitch, don't want you in trouble, pal. Keep it clean. Okay, he says. So, Mama, what the hell is a linnet? Heck, she says, looking piercingly at Dot because she's just laughed out loud. Mitch, say heck. What the heck is a linnet? It's another name for that finch, the one drawn around the hollow, she says. Granddad called it by the Irish name in the Sullivan stories. They're told from the perspective of the linnet. What's that mean? He called it his point of view, the linnet bird being able to peer down onto the family of our ancestors, flying in close sometimes, as close as their most private thoughts, but other times flying way up over Ballydonnegan. That was the village where they lived before they emigrated. What color is the linnet bird? It has greenish feathers, but I've never seen one. It's maybe like a goldfinch with the same kind of body shape and size and that sort of beak. You know those goldfinches. They were always swooping around the meadow out back, somehow or another, managing to pull out of the nastiest, thorniest stalks the softest dang bits of thistledown for their nests. I liked watching that. Me too, Mitch says. And he stops the beat he's been keeping with his shoes, sets his feet on the highest bar of the stool, plunks his elbows onto his knees, and rests his chin in his palms. He sighs a grown-up kind of sigh. Shannon smiles at him apologetically. She finds herself prone to wistful reminiscing ever since they got off the road and settled into Dot's house a month back. She has to catch herself so she doesn't add to her son's melancholy. So the linnet bird, it's got green feathers, Granddad said, and some brown feathers too. Soft colors, she says, forcing some chirpiness into her voice. I saw one at home, he says. No, they're Irish birds, Shannon tells him, though Granddad used to insist he saw one there too, sitting on the window ledge, peeking in at us sometimes. But whenever I looked to where he pointed, there was nothing there at all. He tried to make me believe the bird was one of those she-folk and could make itself invisible to one person and not another. She-folk? You mean girls? He asks. Not that kind of she, Shannon says. She, spelled S-I with a mark over the I. That's an Irish word for the fairies. In one of the Sullivan stories, there's a little girl brings a linnet bird with her onto the ship when the family leaves Ireland. And the way Granddad tells it, that bird swallowed a fairy somewhere along the crossing, so it lived forever. Was Granddaddy on that boat? Oh, no, he's not that old. Let me see. And Shannon squints at the tin ceiling tiles, star-shaped, most of them, trying to work out the generations. Granddad is actually your great-granddad, so his granddad was on the boat. Daniel came over as a little boy, about your age, Mitchie. He had a sister, Mary, a few years older than he was. She was the girl with the linnet bird. I have a question, Dot says. She is sitting on the counter now, having made room for herself by shifting some of her many spice jars. She collects glass jars of interesting shapes and colors. A peacock filled with thyme is at her left hip. At her right is a clear blue kitten half full of cinnamon. She has her hand up like she's in a classroom. Mitch calls his great-granddad granddad. What does he call his real granddad then? Your dad? Nothing, Shannon says. My grandparents raised me. My father was, and she pauses there. Drug added, Mitch says. Now, where did you hear that? Shannon asks him, surprised. Granddaddy, when I was crying about my papa being gone, he told me the story of your daddy and how he got drug added. The word is addict, she says, and I'm sure Granddad made it clear that it wasn't all that simple. He had some physical problems, my father. Got in a mining accident and hurt his leg real bad. Had to go on disability. And he took the drugs, and then your mama took the drugs, Mitch says, as if he were saying any normal thing. He's heard this narrative a lot in the mountains. And then they left. I'm sorry, Dot says. Are they still alive? Shannon shrugs. Maybe my father is. He used to write sometimes, say he was coming back one day to set things right, but it's been a while since I got one of those letters. There could be one there in the hollow, Mitch says. We get our mail forwarded here now, Shannon tells him. It could have got stuck in a corner of the mailbox, he says. We should go check. Dot lifts a bag of pretzel logs from the counter, holds it out to Mitch. These are fun to eat. You can pretend they're cigars. Want one? Okay, he says. He takes a pretzel out and acts like he's smoking. Shannon sighs. How about we don't pack any of those in his school lunches? Okay, Dot says, taking an imaginary puff from her own pretzel, which makes the boy giggle. Mitchie, Shannon says to him now, you do know that what happened with your father is not what happened with mine, right? How do you know? He asked back. Your daddy didn't have a drug problem. He had a pride problem. Whenever he couldn't get work, he didn't want to face you and me and Muriel. I guess he thought trying to forget us would be preferential to feeling worthless around us. Maybe he's got a job now, Mama. Maybe he's at home. How would we know, us not being there? You know, he could call me, Shannon says. If he did, would we go back and be a family again in our old house? Dot tries to let herself quietly off the counter now, but accidentally topples a purple fish that holds her cumin. She writes it, says, is that Muriel I hear waking from her nap? I think I'll just go check on her. Then she puts a hand on Shannon's shoulder and gives it a squeeze before she pads out of the room and up a flight of stairs, sun-splashed from the skylight overhead. I didn't hear anything, Mitch says. Shannon gets up from the table. Come on now, why don't we settle onto the couch and I'll start into that story for you. About how the Sullivans got to the hollow, he asks, hopping off the stool and following her, taking loud bites of pretzel and leaving behind a trail of crumbs on the polished wood slats of the floor. Yep, and I'm going to tell it in Granddad's way. In the voice of the green linnet, she nods. Also in pieces, so you have to be patient. One story on each cross quarter. What's that? Well, think of the year as a circle, like that tire on the bike Dottie bought you. Only say that there aren't so many spokes, just enough to make 4 parts. And those represent the 4 seasons, winter, spring. I know what the seasons are, Mama. I'm in kindergarten, remember? He climbs up onto the couch and sifts through the pillows there. All different, all old, all from flea markets and yard sales, Dot not capable of driving by one without stopping. Mitch especially likes the pillow with the silky tassels around it and the washed out print of the natural bridge of Virginia on the front. He leans against it and watches his mother stoke the fire, wakening orange flames that dance off the walls and the plate glass window that makes Dot's dormant garden seem a still picture, but for when a car passes along the roadway beyond the fence, or when a neighboring sparrow lands on the roof of one of her many birdhouses. Shannon sits on the couch now, too, pushes her shoes off, and pulls her feet up under her. Mitch nestles into the crook of her arm. She goes on explaining. Seasons start and end at solstices and equinoxes, those times that Lita is always paying attention to. But it was the mid-season marks, the cross quarters, that were most important to our ancestors every year, going back all the way to the ancient days. They had fire festivals then, meant to give them good luck with planting and harvesting and things. That's why Granddad told the stories to us only during those times. So I have to wait 1,000,000 days between parts of the story? 3 months. It's February now, and the next will be in May. At first, I thought that was long too, and I was older than you when Granddad got to telling me. She thinks, in fact, that Mitch is too young for the story, but he wants her to tell it so badly, won't leave her alone about it ever since Sean brought it up on their trip out west. Will they get to the hollow today? He is pushed in about as close as he can to his mother now. and his thumb finds its way into his mouth. Lately, he's been reverting back to these ways, holding a Raggedy Bear a lot, pulling one of his old baby blankets from Muriel's drawer, and sleeping with it draped over his pillow. No, not today, she says. On this day, Imbolc, or Bridget's Day, they're on their way back from a holy well up on a mountain that stands between their village and the rest of Ireland. From way up high, the linnet birds see them, tiny blots moving along a path through open pastures, one leading the way, a boy, two in the middle, connected by a hand clasp, and one trailing behind, a girl, sometimes near to the rest and sometimes far off. She is known for getting lost. At times, from up here, you can't tell her from the sheep in the fields. Closer in now, though, you can see what is what. See the lamb leaping in the grass, now nursing from the ewe who gave birth to her this week. The lamb was the sign, it was, that told the family and all the other families that it was time to honor Bridget, to ask the warrior saint to bless home and hearth, bless the plots they'd soon be seeding. This is why the girl Mary and all of them are in their best clothes. Though she holds a blanket about her to stay warm, you can see the hem of her favorite skirt flapping in a wind gust, faded now to something close to lavender. But the fabric was the shade of a bluebird when her ma first gave it its color, from a dye made of brambleberries and an ink from a rare ocean mollusk that her ma won't speak the name of. It's bad luck, she says, gets the fairies upset. Mary has been tugging at the waistband of the skirt all morning. It is tight, which annoys her, but it shows she's had a fine winter of eating. The pits in the ground where they store their lumpers, what they call the potatoes they grow, had been so full from the fall's final harvest that they hadn't been rationing so much, not worrying about running out like usual before the picking of the first tender new potatoes that don't ripen till summer. Never had they seen such a lumper crop, said the old women who stood in doorways and puffed on clay pipes. The ones believing in signs looked upon the abundance nervously, but never said, not aloud, what concerned them. They merely exchanged glances behind curls of smoke. This feast day, then, will end with a real feast, even a pig roast, because a couple of the villagers feel confident enough in the future earnings at the mine to give theirs up. The pigs are raised each year, one in each yard, fed off of a family's food scraps to sell at market to pay the annual rents. The pig is just about the only sort of livestock they can manage to have. There had been laws set up back when the British first took over Ireland with their armies, saying people of their kind couldn't own cows or other large animals, couldn't do a lot of things, like go to school, which they had done anyway, secretly, in caves and behind hedgerows, or own any land, not any at all, but instead pay rent to live on the farms and fields that had been in their families from time eternal, now on tiny parcels just big enough to hold a pig and a potato garden. But none of this was in Mary's thoughts as she waved a slender stick in the air now, walking there behind the rest. This was her prize of the morning, that she devoted herself to while the grown-ups prayed at the well, dropping smooth stones to count the rounds. She'd found the tree herself, going off alone, as was often her way, and pulled the branch down, then rubbed it against the rock till it was almost white. It was much better than the one she'd made last year, she thought, and she'd lay it out on the ground outside the hut before going to bed, sure that Bridget would come down and pick it up to do her blessing of their family, of all of Ballydonegan. What Mary didn't know, and what one of the older girls might well have told her if she hadn't gone off alone, is that the tree she found was not the right one for the making of any wand. The blackthorn, just now showing its buds to say that yes, spring would come again this year and push away the dark and cold, was a complicated tree. There were some rules to follow, such as never break a limb off, never. Daniel, the youngest of the family, if you don't count the speck inside his ma, that is too small for any of them to know about yet, too small to start her worrying about losing to a bad hunger year, as it happened with the last one when it stopped growing inside her, had been busy up on the mountain that morning too, but running with a pack, gathering the grasses and rushes that fill his arms now as he heads toward the village, toward the beehive roofs made of the same stuff he carries. They would be thatching the roofs anew soon enough, the men and women of the village, as they did every year, climbing up on one hut, then the next. But the armloads that Daniel and the others are carrying down this midday are not for that task, no. They are for making the thing that Daniel has been itching to start since morning light, this being the first year he will take part and not be sent off by the older kids to help his ma in the kitchen. Now the oldest children of the village, their own arms filled with kindling, would be in charge of making the bonfire. And Daniel would have a real part in the making of Bridget herself. This is what takes up his thoughts as he pushes forward on the path, his pace quickening with each step now, until he is as far ahead of his ma and da as Mary is behind. So book 2 is structured in these cross quarters that Shannon described, 4 of them, each about 25 pages. And each one is divided equally between the contemporary storyline, what is going on with Shannon and her family, and the historical storyline, their ancestors from Ireland who are wending their way toward the Appalachians. I say this as part of pointing out that these two stories are functioning as equals. One does not eclipse the other. The hope, as the writer, is that readers are equally engaged in the outcomes of those two storylines. Multiple storylines are not unusual in a novel, but I think what makes this particular technique interesting to analyze is that the historical plotline is not separate from the action of the story. In most novels with multiple storylines, they are presented in separate chapters, and the characters in the main action don't have any awareness of those stories being told. As you could see from the excerpt, in Encircling Flight, we're very aware of the presence of the storyteller as character. You might say that the story itself is part of the plot. When I was writing this novel, I wasn't intentional about using this technique. It just flowed from muse to fingertips, whatever. But later, when I analyzed this work and kind of deconstructed it, I decided that I must have been influenced by my interest in fairy tales and tellers. I teach a literature course on fairy tales at Washington and Lee. And I always focus attention, of course, on the origins, the lore passed down by oral tradition, going way back. But I also give a lot of attention to a fascinating group of storytellers that are more modern, 7 women writers from the 17th century French salons who started the first major fairy tale vogue in publishing, and in fact coined the term that translates into fairy tale. They used embedded stories in their works, and always with this same technique of having them delivered by a storyteller who is in the cast of characters. They did this in a couple of ways. Some of these women wrote novels, and in those, a character or characters told fairy tales aloud to a semblance of people, original tales, often stories that were analogous to their own situations or somebody in the novel. And the women all wrote fairy tales as well, very popular ones that are quite interesting to study for a variety of reasons. And these often had embedded tales with a fairy or other character telling a story aloud that explained a curse, for instance, or something else important to a reader's engagement with the story. On a meta level, too, this paradigm played out in social settings with these women. In the salons they hosted and attended, they would physically get up and tell or act out fairy tales they were developing. They'd get feedback, work collaboratively before setting pen to paper, a workshop of sorts. The telling of the tales was integral to the salon itself. So I thought, yeah, that's where I got that idea, channeling these women. But then I looked back at some other books I've written back between 2000 and 2006 when I was writing books for children. This was before I was teaching the fairy tale or had learned about the salon women. But I discovered I was using this technique in some of those books, if in a more simplistic way. So in this one, which came out with Scholastic in the year 2000. There's a 10-year-old girl who's keeping a journal on her computer, and she likes to present anecdotes about what happens in her day in the form of stories. So she gives them titles, and they have the end. And so it's written in this journal that she keeps, and also along epistolary lines. This book, which came out in 2006 with Lerner, is about a teenager who's writing letters to a friend. She's on a trip and she's writing old-fashioned letters because they're planning to do that. And she does the same, not as much as the other one, but she will describe a party or something and turn it into a story, give it a title and tell it in a storyteller way. None of these involve, an oral storyteller, but the presence of a storyteller is there, or the development. But whether natural tendency or not, a writer can be intentional about how they use embedded stories in their fiction, even if I wasn't intentional ahead of time. I was in the revision process, so in working, thinking about how I wanted to do it. So, and I think there's a benefit to this form, having the storyteller present in the story. I think that there are some advantages to that help with the writing process. I think it can make a writer more aware of voice, since the narrator is a character as opposed to an invisible, omniscient entity delivering a story. And in that way, the embedded story itself can help flesh out or build up that character. So a quid pro quo of sorts. It can make the novel structure more seamless, in that the backstory doesn't have to be its own chapter. It can wend its way through in short snippets or long passages whenever it makes sense in the plot. In the cross quarter I read from Imolk, that story is told as one intact. And so there's the contemporary story is going on before it and after it. But that isn't the case throughout the book. As you'll see in another excerpt I'll read in a minute, it weaves through. Something else that I find personally very satisfying about this technique is that it evokes that ancient tradition that of lore being passed down by an oral storyteller, which is where the first fictions came from. It makes me feel part of an ongoing, evolving process in a palpable way. And here's a point that applies to embedded stories, regardless of what technique you decide to use. They can be great vehicles for writing about something you're passionate about or you already know about. In my case, creating a story for an Irish family that is fleeing the Great Hunger in the west of Ireland was not work for me. It was a history that I was already immersed in because it was the story of my own ancestors, and I'd traveled to Ireland and done a lot of research over the years. So it wasn't a time-consuming research task to create that story. There are a lot of different immigrant groups that settled in the Appalachians, and if I'd chosen another one, German or Italian, Portuguese immigrants, I would have been starting from scratch to understand those characters and their migrations. So the point is, regardless of the main plot of your story and whether you're writing a novel, novella, or short story, you might be able to extend and enrich your fiction by weaving in something that you're already an expert on, that is already there in your writer's toolbox. I'm going to leave off with a reading from the third cross quarter, Lunaza, which is told by Granddad, who Dot, Shannon, and Mitch are visiting in a nursing home. Granddad has dementia, kind of mid-stage, where he can remember some things, but not others. He confuses one family member with another. He sometimes thinks Mitch is Sean, for instance, even though there's a big age difference. He confuses the generations. Something else you need to know to hop into this excerpt is that Granddad doesn't like living there and tends to have kerfuffles with the staff. His complaint on this day is a new rule that says residents aren't allowed to nap on the furniture in the lobby. Also, There's a reference to a poet who the Irish mother Julia admires. This poet is named Speranza, and she's part of an activist group called Young Ireland that was fighting for Irish independence at the time. Granddaddy, do you know how Danny Boy got to the Hollow? Mitch asks. Of course. How? His daddy bought that scrap of land from a Cherokee Indian, Granddad says. But why am I telling you this? You know the Sullivan story, Sean. I told it to you myself. Mitch, I said I'd tell it on the road, on the way back home, Shannon reminds him. I know, but you'll end it without anyone getting to the Hollow. You always do. They'll get there eventually, she says. I don't want them to get there eventually. I want them to get there now. What month is it? Granddad asks. August, Mitch says. Tough luck, he says. It's only Lunasa. He's still in Ireland. But you know that chapter. No, I don't, Mitch says, impatience in his voice now. It was the Harvest Festival, Shannon says to him. Started back when the Celts would pray to the god Lu to make sure the crops came in good. You mean the potatoes, Mitch asks. Our ancestors in the story would have had the potatoes in mind. Yeah, she says. Is that all that grew in Ireland? Oh, no, Granddad says gruffly. The plantations grew a lot of wheat, and they grew barley and oats and who knows what else, all for sending off to England, so it might as well have grown on Jupiter for the good it did our people. Papa Danny Boy railed about that till his dying day. Will you tell me about the day of the festival, Granddaddy? Mitch asks. The festival? He repeats, and then he pauses, twirls a bit of beard, and takes a tug as if on a lever. Do you smell that? You mean that really strong antiseptic mixed with baby powder smell? Dot says. She knocks off her sandals and tucks her feet under her. It's overpowering, this place. Not that smell, Dottie, Shannon says. She leans now against her grandfather's shoulder, nearing its century mark, but still ample. The food is something he doesn't complain about here. He was taught from a young age not to scoff at a meal, never. Not that one, no, he says. Mary noticed it first, early in the morning. It woke her up, it did, so strong it was, though the others would soon tell her they didn't smell anything at all. It was there nonetheless. Mary could actually see the particles of it, not against the dim sky, but against the full moon framed in the window that Lunasa morning. She-horses, silhouetted against the white disk, drew carriages full of it, the pieces of smell flying from the windows like dry leaves. The highest race of fairies, the ones full of hubris, were hooting and hollering as they kicked the smell around, dragged it, pulled it apart till it was a black miasma. The lesser fairies had it piled on their backs in willow creels. It was so heavy, that smell, that they were staggering under it. Some had to stop right there on the moon and take a rest, panting, their wings trembling by their sides. That was the halfway point between the Tir na Nog and Ballydonegan, Mary surmised, as she watched from her bed, Daniel's arm curled around her, her nightdress bunched into his fist like a security blanket. He thought of her like that, as a protector, she knew this, and it was all the more why she wanted to get up to see if her whistle could change the course of things. It had often made the fairies dance, hadn't it? But doing that would mean waking up her brother, waking up her ma and da. And everyone knows it's disrespectful to pull a body from sleep like that. Granddad shouted this last part in the direction of the man in the teddy bear scrubs who has reappeared and is now setting up a few rows of chairs in the center of the lobby. He acts as if he didn't hear, but everyone heard. The women now gathered around a table putting together a jigsaw puzzle, who give him a collective giggle, one a fist pump, and the receptionist who sighs in his direction. I like the Appalachian style you bring to that story, Granddad, Dot says. What do you mean? He asks, tucking the wavy tips of his beard under his belt. You know, the exaggeration, the mountain tall tale. You do it well, sir. He wags his head from side to side. Oh, no, it's all true. Keep going, Pawpaw, Shannon says. I forgot where I am. At a nursing home, Mitch tells him. I know that, he says, but there's a tinge of terror in his expression as he takes in the room. If it were me, Shannon says, I'd move on to Cornelius now. Granddad pats his beard, in that way you might pat a crying baby's back. He lets his eyes settle on the window next to the sofa. A tree has grown so close that it is touching the glass. There's a nest there in that branch, he says, pointing a crooked finger, remembering a messy collection of twigs and feathers. But maybe it's not that tree, maybe not even that window. He sees a lot of trees after all, spends his days in pursuit of windows. It's the fever, Cornelius says to Julia, after Mary tells them of the smell, after she goes outside with the whistle to sit atop the raised rock the ancients put out in the field, what they call the stone table. Her parents can hear from the hut the melodies she plays out there, one she has been perfecting for weeks. Conversing, she tells her parents, it's called when they ask her the name of the song. Pleading is what she might call it this day, but they don't ask. Nonsense, Julia says. I felt her head. She's fine. But he is not convinced. He is certain he can see the children shrinking. He puts fingers around his wife's wrists in the night when she sleeps, measuring the loss since the end of the lumber supply. They hadn't exactly run out, but there's a limit to how long you can store the crop before the rot sets in, no matter how big the harvest of that last fall. They knew it would be coming. We're in better shape than usual, Julia reminds him often, but still he watches them all carefully as they sleep each night. Still he curls around her warm body, an arm over her growing middle, waiting for kicks, elbow jabs, and cursing silently the guards' bantry posts as soon as he knows they've no food left in their stores. Not many lumpers had gone to waste, really, what with feeding all but the very nastiest ones to the pigs. They were fattened to the point of being round as barrels, each and every one. Their stubby legs would give out now and again, and they'd roll down the hills, some right off the cliff. Mine rolled all the way to America, a woman said in front of the chapel last Sunday, standing with her children by the ditch, where they'd built a scalp from the remains of their toppled home. Those passersby who still had their pigs were suspect, thought that the family had given in and eaten theirs. The man who pays the rent, as they call it. And that's why the woman and her children were on the roads now. This is the reason Cornelius doesn't go to the festival today. Not because of the woman or the rolling pigs exactly, but because of his own mounting fear. Every Lunasa, it was true, he suggested they stay in their townland, not go to the big fair in Bearhaven. He didn't like how the miles-long walk, while not a great burden when they were hardy, drained them fast during this time before the harvest could begin, before they could dig up those first tender orbs, the ones just below the surface, so easy to pull from the dark, supple soil that even a small child could scoop them up in cupped hands. Connie, relax. The new potatoes will be ripe in a matter of weeks, Julia reminds him, looking into hollow eyes, getting hollower from little sleep, from little food. He claimed to be full on half an oatcake this morning so the children could take his share. The pilgrimage is an important part of the day. You know that. The bilberries will be out on the ridges, so we'll pick and eat as we go. No worries. And Mary has been aching to hear the harpists, Danny to see the games, the vendors. Someone always gives in to his sweet face, lets him have a bun or a candy. And you know what I'm looking forward to? He does, and realizing he has no sway, tells her he will get there later, that he has errands. It's young Ireland, of course, that Julia's thinking of. She's sure that Speranza will be there, and even more sure of it, for some moments anyway, when she hears a woman at the fair reciting a poem with a rise and fall cadence of a bard. She rushes to the performance, pulling the children with her, and stands at the back of the crowd that has gathered. Mine eye is dull, my hair is white, this arm is powerless for the fight. Alas, alas, the battle's van suits not a weak and aged man. Thine eye is bright, thine arm is strong. 'Tis youth must right our country's wrong. These are, for sure, Speranza's words from the old man's blessing. But it takes only a verse for Julia to realize it is not her doublet poetess in the flesh. These lines are spoken in Irish, a translation. And Julia has learned enough about Speranza to know that she does not have the Gaelic language among her talents. So it is with a measure of disappointment that she listens to the rest of the poem. Arise, arise, my patriot son. By hearts like thine is freedom won. There's rousing applause at this last line, led by the young Irelanders, who Julia can see now have a strong presence at the fair, men and women with placards and handbills encouraging rebellion, these written too in the language of the West Cork peasants. I want to be a rebel, Daniel announces, loudly enough to be heard by some members of the constabulary, whose heads tip disapprovingly in his direction. There are many of them at the fringes of the crowd, standing tall with hands behind their backs, sticks at the ready, tipping her own head disapprovingly at their ranks. Julia tugs on the children's hands, leads them away. You're not old enough to be a rebel, she says to Daniel as they stroll the harbor. A schooner is anchored just offshore, its name, the Circassian, painted into its hull. She recognizes it as one of the emigrant ships, one of the many from this port during the crossing season, now winding down for the year. But others will fight for you and take back Ireland, so you'll have no need to be a rebel yourself. You can be a farmer, grow what you want on land you own. Will I have a cow? Always. Daniel sniffs the air now, smells the baked goods and says, you want a roll, Mary? I can get you one. No stealing, Julia reminds him. No getting in trouble. But they're all over there, Ma, he says, pointing to the police still gathered around the poet. They're not near the food. Which was precisely Cornelius's thought that morning, and why he planned the detour. Bantry, who himself would be in London, as always, would surely not, on this day, have a full contingent of guards around the game preserve. The planter's highest priority would be the granary and the cattle, for the exports were of the most value to him. He'd have all the redcoats posted around those, and the Irish police he normally contracted would be attending the fair, reveling or guarding, one or the other. McCarthy Moore himself went to the fair, Cornelius knew from the years, for it was a place of business transactions, land deals that Bantry would surely want his agent to get a part of. Maybe Cornelius would have to face a local boy or two, he figured, hired to keep out poachers. But he wasn't worried. On a day such as this, with no supervision, any young man would be into the whiskey by now. It was human nature. That's the kind of confidence Cornelius carried with him as he sidled through the gate. Mary was listening to the harp when she saw some of it skating along the bay, bouncing off the mast of that tall ship and doing a loop-de-loop. When it hit the pier just next to where they sat, she gasped and pulled her feet up under her, so sure it was going to reach them, touch land. But instead it shattered into the air, rained down on the waves like sparks from a volcano. It was awfully close, and she wished she had her whistle to push it back to sea. It had seemed to work this morning. I want to go home, she says to her mother. Julia looks at her, surprised that her daughter would ask to go before the music was over. But the girl had not been right all day. It seemed in a trance, going from one thing to the next, her hand never letting loose of her mother's. Julia touches Mary's forehead for the umpteenth time, but it is not the fever. She is sure of that, at least. Don't you want to wait on your da? She asked, but it's half-hearted, her eyes on the sun, its journey to the west begun. What does this say? Daniel asked, picking up a piece of paper that has blown their way, almost blown off the pier. Julia studies it there in his hand and says, it's an advertisement for laborers to work on a railroad. In the Blue Ridge Mountains, an old woman sitting near them says, the mountains are blue? Daniel asks, wide-eyed. And I'll leave it there. I hope that if you ever get a chance to read it, that you will enjoy this book. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.